Yeah, so let me introduce also the speaker of the series events. This event is the first in the Notice Scholar series that we run every year. Our aim is to offer a vibrant space for exchange by introducing the work of urgent, critical, and influential scholars and artists to our faculty, students, and participants. The interdisciplinary series aims to feature each speaker's critical ideas and creative work at the radical edges of scholarly, artistic, and activism. It fosters critical and creative dialogues on current questions, theoretical and methodological approaches, and practice interventions around social justice. Oh, thank you. Okay. I have a copy of the poster here, but I think it's not quite being distributed yet, but you can see it, our speeches online, the ones that we have. This course also runs alongside GRSJ 500, which is the introductory course for graduate students. It's a course where students read the speaker's work and remain in conversation with them after the event. As part of this course, students are also given the opportunity to introduce the event itself, the speakers, and to give a land acknowledgement given their own critical knowledge and experience. So let me give the floor to them. Let me introduce the two students who will be introducing the speakers, who I must also thank for being willing to go first during only the second week of classes, so having very little prep time. So thank you very much. The first, or actually the second, will be Hazel Zhang, a first-year master's student in the GRSJ department at UBC. They are a second-generation immigrant living on Coast Salish lands. They engage in multidisciplinary praxis with a BFA in printmaking from the Rhode Island School of Design and a double minor in literary art studies and history, philosophy, and the social sciences. To begin by giving our land acknowledgement, may I introduce our student, Haneen Shaf, who is from Gaza, occupied Palestine. She holds an undergraduate degree in English literature from the Islamic University of Gaza and a master's degree in international affairs from Pennsylvania State University. Haneen is currently a PhD student at GRSJ and a researcher at Race and Disability Canada.
Good morning or maybe good afternoon. So I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people who have cared for this land for thousands of years. Colonization is not history. It continues today, including through institutions like education, which are built on systematic operation of indigenous communities and ongoing legacies of cultural and physical genocide. We must also recognize that settler colonialism is a global project. In occupied Palestine, we are witnessing the devastating consequences of occupation, apartheid, and forced displacement by so-called Israel. Over the past 2 years, Israel has killed over 65,000 of Palestinians, including the professors, scholars, and students like us, alongside widespread destruction and Israeli engineered famine. Indigenous peoples are not numbers, Palestinians are not numbers, and no one is. Acknowledging land must go beyond words. It must be tied to action. So let this be a call to honor those lost here in Palestine and across the globe by standing in solidarity with those resisting occupation and fighting for land, life, and freedom. As we begin today's discussion, I invite us all to consider how our work, academic or otherwise, can support broader movements for justice and land back. And now I would like to invite my colleague, Hazel Zhang, to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Hazel. Jasbir Puar is a distinguished Faculty of Arts professor in the Social Justice Institute at the University of British Columbia, extraordinary professor in the Women's and Gender Studies Department at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, and Professor Emerita at Rutgers University, where she was faculty in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department for 23 years. Puar is the author of the award-winning books, The Right to Name, Debility, Capacity, Disability, which has been translated into Spanish and is forthcoming in Portuguese and terrorist assemblages. Terrorist assemblages, homo nationalism in queer times. Available in French, Spanish, and Portuguese, and reissues as an expanded version for its 10th anniversary. Her articles have been published in journals such as Social Text and South Atlantic Quarterly, mainstream venues such as Al Jazeera and The Guardian, and translated into more than 20 languages. Dr. Puar is also co-author of exhibitions for the Sharjah Architecture Triennial and the Sharjah Art Biennial. In 2019, she received the Kessler Award from the Center for Gay and Lesbian Studies at CUNY, which recognizes lifetime achievement in and impact on queer research and organizing. Dr. Lara Sheehi, welcome to UBC, is a clinical psychologist and a research fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences. Lara's scholarly work is committed to decolonial and feminist methodologies and is especially interested in psychoanalysis, the psychic refusals central to liberation and life-making struggles in the global South. The psychic dimension of revolution and critical Zionist studies. She is co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, which won the Middle East Monitor's 2022 Palestine Book Award for Best Academic Book. Lara is the president of the Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychology, and co-editor of Studies in Gender and Sexuality. Lara is a member of the founding collective for the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. She is currently working on a new book, From the Clinic to the Street, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures. Please welcome Dr. Lara Sheehi and Dr. Jasbir Puar to the conversation.
I'm just going to stand for a moment just to kind of orient us. I wanted to thank Haneen and also Hazel for the land acknowledgements and also for the introductions. First, I want to say it's so wonderful to have you here. Lara and I have been in conversation for years now, but actually this is the first time we're meeting in person. So it feels really special to be together. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I also want to thank all of you for being here as well. I realize many of you could be chowing down at the faculty and staff back to school barbecue. So we feel honored that you're joining us for sandwiches. It is the 704th day of the genocide of Gaza. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that we're sitting here in this nexus of really inspiring work and this kind of opportunity to think together and to be together, and at the same time, you know, reeling and devastated and angry in regards to, you know, just the violence of the last few days, not to mention nearly the past 2 years, the anniversary of which is coming up. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity for a kind of collective witnessing here today that we can hold space for together. So there's 2 books here that we're talking about. The first one, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, which is published in 2022 by you and your partner, Stephen Sheehi. And then the forthcoming book, which I was lucky enough to read at the introduction, From the Clinic to the Streets, which is coming out in 2026 with Pluto Press. So I'm going to move back and forth between these 2 projects. And I'm just going to ask a few questions and then we'll open it up for audience discussion. So the first project being focused, if you haven't taken a look at the book, which is phenomenal, on the practice of psychoanalysis in Palestine and how that praxis becomes a form of kind of collective revolutionary life-making. And the second book, which is really challenging, I think, and both books are doing this, but the second book, which is really about challenging psychoanalytic praxis and theory to become a kind of pathway for liberation and freedom, right? And particularly, I think, in terms of its praxis in North America, but also informed by all of your experiences in the last couple of years, but not only, you know, making waves in the worlds of psychoanalysis, to say the very least, but really coming up against the orthodoxies long-held orthodoxies of psychoanalytic thought. So, so if anyone is able to convince us that analysis could be radical and revolutionary, it is Lara. It's okay if I stand, because I'm trying to
Yeah, of
project since
course.
we don't have the microphone.
The Arab in me wants to stand with you
Yeah,
so much.
we can also go for that. There's nothing keeping anyone from standing. So you open From the Clinic to the Street with this story of disruption at a psychoanalytic panel in 2017. I remember when that conference happened, because New York was like a buzz with news about, oh my God, there's going to be this whole, I think it was almost a whole day set aside to talk about Palestine, or an afternoon or something. And you were talking about the ways in which the Zionists kept trying to disrupt these forums, and that even speaking the word Palestine can trigger repression. And you were in this position of refusing the attempts at colonial reality bending by the agitated Zionists in the room. And also, you mentioned that the audience is completely passive, right? No one else everyone is not refusing to intervene. And so you enacted what you're calling in the book psychic militancy. So when I was reading this introduction, I had this moment of recognizing you and remembering when we first met, which was through another instance of colonial reality bending. So by way of greater introduction, Lara and I met because we were both targets of Zionist harassment campaigns, although at different times. So Lara came to me through a friend and was like, how do we do this? You've done this, how do we do this, you know? There's this silver lining, obviously, in being targeted, that we get to build community through those targetings. And this is, our friendship is one of those beautiful silver linings. But what happened with Lara's response to her response to being targeted and smeared and defamed, it didn't follow the usual conventions of, like, the conventions at that time were like, do not respond, go dark on social media, let the media cycle play itself out. Then you release a very carefully timed public rebuttal, and then you hope that the Zionists move on, right? And Lara was like, no, she changed the rules of this game by doing everything that we were at the time told not to do. She documented the hate mail and posted it online. She wrote back to her attackers. She spoke out right away. She responded to every single accusation, no matter how ridiculous. And I think this was an important moment in early 2023 for the movement and for realigning our tactics to fight back. And at the time, I was completely wowed by you and how brave you were. But now I realize, upon reading the introduction of the book, that you were enacting this practice, the practice of psychic militancy. And this is how it's defined in the book. Quote, psychic intrusions are meant to make access to material realities, such as, there is a thing called Palestine. It is inhabited by Palestinians. And that psychic intrusion is meant to make that fact, that material fact, confusing, irrelevant, or impossible. Psychic militancy, on the other hand, is unbendingly affixed to material reality, a psychic militancy against psychic intrusions, a psychic militancy that arms us in the increasingly crucial fight over our psychic province. And I also love that thinking, our psychic province. So this all seems so important right now, especially since it is a struggle to speak of Palestine in so many places, and so many of us are under duress to stay silent. Can you tell us more about what you understood about that scene and other scenes of colonial reality, mind bending, as you've called it, and how you came to psychic militancy? It's not just an idea. It's an orientation, it's a praxis of theory as well, as what I understood. And then also, I think it's an embodiment also. So.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you folks for coming out. When Jasbir describes this, it's very moving for me. So I'm going to start by bringing in the affect into the room. A lot of times when we're talking about Palestine, and this is how psychic intrusions work, in general, the carceral discipline is very much about, like, vacate the affect. And vacating the affect, I think, is the way that we start to sort of completely disembody ourselves and separate from the material reality that, like, we should all be feeling, and we do. but there's an invitation to immediately just vacate that. So it's really, you know, Jasbir's presence during that time was central to my ability to practice psychic militancy, which I didn't have the words for that yet. I just knew it viscerally. And I think this is where Frantz Fanon comes online immediately for us, that there's something that's coursing through your body that's intuitive, that has a legacy and a history that predates us. And something internally is saying this is the direction to go. But I just kind of want to bring it into the relationality, the comradeship, which is why it's very emotional to me. Because against the crush of like atomization, settler colonial logics works to atomize us, to make us feel alone, to make us feel isolated, to make us feel so small in the face of everything. And then comradeship and thinking through together and opening up space and generosity. Because I mean, you, Stephen Salaita, so many folks were just like, what do you need? And Jasbir was on the phone with me every single day. We'd never met. And it was like, but that's the legacy that binds us. And I think if we're thinking about psychic militancy, it's to move beyond and also see a logic that repeats itself, right? So I think in that moment, through the relationality, through solidarity, there's a way in which I started to realize what was being asked of me, what was being demanded of me viscerally, right? I knew what was happening. I knew that this was not new. I mean, you know, from your case, from Stephen, from cases before us, that this is a logic that repeated itself and was an extension of Zionist expansionism, right? So smear campaigns become part of the logic of expansionism. And then I started to realize, but there's something happening psychologically too. And that started to me thinking about the theft of the psychic terrain as part of that, right? Because there was a way in which I was being pulled to self-discipline, and all I could think about is to refuse individualizing this process and remain tethered to the structural pieces that were at play. What does it mean that a parallel process is happening when settler colonial logics is about disappearing and displacing and dispossessing? What does it mean when that comes to coalesce in an individual attack, the parallel process being the same thing? In my case, it was actually articulated, like, of all the things that ended up happening, there was many disinterpretations, of course, this happens, but what was articulated that helped me kind of connect this as well, in the same way that in this conference, when the Zionist aggressor comes in and blocks the door and has a kufi that has Israeli flags all over it and warriors up and looks at me and starts flexing his muscles and sort of saying there's no such thing as Palestinians and there's no room for this, is that it was articulated that if world events were different, therefore, if anti-Semitism didn't exist, it would be okay for Lara to speak, to do anything. The messaging there is disappear the Arab as a fix for anti-Semitism, right? That is not an individualized process. Right. We see this displaced into Palestine. The fantastical idea that if the indigenous is entirely cleansed, that somehow the settler could come to take the place and all of us would forget, right? There's an inversion, of course, that's Patrick Wolf's idea. But that, I think, is where the psychic militancy was like, there's something happening here to draw me, to conscript me into believing that somehow there was some way I could act that would change this, that this logic would unfold differently, that me disciplining myself in a particular way. I mean, people, usually white women, I will name this, would reach out to me and say, why don't you just apologize? And then this would, apart from the apologize about what, like for my existence, right? But even in fact, I didn't even have to speak before that fantasy was mobilized. So I think this is part of it. And the antidote to that, this is the militancy part, was what does it mean to enact presence and defiance? And this is what we're seeing every single day. Again, that is not an individual process. That means under the crush of a genocidal war machine that insists, that's predicated on erasure and disappearance, what does it mean at every turn to antagonize that attempt? What does it mean to be boldly present, right? Leon Sisson talks about presencing. What does it mean to be boldly present? And I think that's what guided me. It was like every attempt to tell me to shut up, to tell me to be silent, which, by the way, is racist and sexist and all the other ways in which we get disciplined. And of course, you and I have spoken about this before, about how it falls on racial and gender lines.
Yeah.
It was incredibly racialized, it was sexualized, it was about domination, it was about coercion. And I realized that, you know, psychologically speaking, abusers do their work knowing that people won't speak back. And that is the way that it functions structurally too. The expectation is this will not be disrupted. I can get away with this. It's about power and domination. And so I think the piece of distilling what does psychic militancy mean? How does it become a political practice? And this is where Fanon helps, because it can't just be an individualized psychological reflexive process that we're invited into pop psychology, right? Like somehow you just do this and, you know, it's a self-help aspect. No, it's a political commitment. And I think the repetition was key. This is where, like, seizing psychoanalysis, psychoanalysts love me for this, you can imagine, but I'm just like, if there's a compulsion to repeat that Freud talks about, what does it mean for us to seize that and turn it on its head? What does it mean for us to say, actually, it's violence that repeats, it's this logic that repeats, it's this intent to erase us that repeats. And so the ferocity of our repetition is important too. That I didn't have words for that then, but I can trace it and say, this is what I was doing. When that guy came in, I was writing to myself saying, he's trying to disrupt you. And this is not individual. This is what Zionists do. They come in and they deflect and they want to make no space for Palestine, no space for Arabness, certainly no space for Arab women or a speaking subject in terms of saying that. So I think there was, it's kind of coalesced and came together. And when you start drawing the lines and then seeing how often it repeats itself, it kind of emerges as a praxis.
Yeah, I think the one of the most important things is the refusal to be individualized.
Yes.
Because so much of targeting is about isolating and atomizing the person who's being targeted. And I think that it's different post October 7th, 2023, because there's so many people being targeted. But before that, it was, you know, we were a small group of folks. And so it was so easy to kind of internalize that targeting and to presume somehow that you could have avoided being targeted, right?
Yes.
And so that's what I really loved about the way that you, you know, the way that you challenge that logic. And like you said, to move from the individual to the logic is so important, right? In both books, you write about the absenting of Fanon as a key thinker of modern psychoanalysis, which is so amazing to me. Like, of course, I know of Fanon as a psychoanalytic thinker and practitioner, but then to understand something about the way that he is refused in the clinical world and in the theoretical world of psychoanalysis was really kind of, you know, struck me. And then you also talk about how the field is obsessed with unraveling the Freudian notion of taboo in clinical and theoretical praxis, and yet Palestine is this taboo in the professional worlds of psychoanalysis that no one can seem to manage to handle, right? So you write that, ironically enough, Palestine has always been the harbinger of psychoanalytic meltdown, which I love. I'd love to see this meltdown. You know, I'd love to see all these psychoanalytic folks being like melting down amongst those who have been trained to recognize and deal with meltdowns, right? And then you write that the colonized is not a speaking subject, even in the business of the so-called talking cure. So it seems to me that Fanon and Palestine are these constitutive absences of psychoanalysis. This is a kind of twin erasure, and they kind of seem to function as mirrors to each other as well. Like if one falls, the other falls. You know, if we center one, we have to center the other. But these are constitutive absences, which means these absences are necessary for the field and the praxis to exist as it does. Insofar as Palestine has been taboo in many institutional settings, and insofar as Fanon's work has also been compartmentalized in the academy into like acceptable Fanon versus non-acceptable Fanon in the liberal settler university for liberal settler university consumption. I wonder if you could talk specifically about these constitutive absences for psychoanalysis. And I was thinking, like, is Palestine the original taboo for
Mhm.
psychoanalysis. I'm kind of fascinated by this because it seems like with Palestine, psychoanalysis encounters the limits of the applicability of its own analytic frames through Palestine. Like the taboo of Palestine renders psychoanalytic theories of taboo to be impotent in some sense, right? They kind of shatter this open. And so I'm wondering if you could talk us through what are the pressures of the field that constitute Palestine as this perhaps original taboo?
Yeah. Isn't it great to be in conversation? They're awesome questions. Thank you. Let me start there. If it's the originary, right, taboo, perhaps we can think about it in terms of disavowals, right? That like, and disavowals that sort of match what settler colonial logics are based around. And a disavowal meaning that you can live in a reality and bend it such that you never have to actually come in contact with the thing that you are expelling from your consciousness. That's what settlers do. That's what settler colonialism does. We're able to sort of walk around and in our everyday life, constantly dispel the material reality that we are on stolen land, that everything that we see came into being through theft, dispossession, violence, domination, and continues, right? Which is why Hanin's introduction was wonderful, seriously, saying that this continues. This is not just a thing of the past that we now just acknowledge, right? So if the originary aspect is disavowal, it's a disavowal to stabilize the psychoanalysis, the version of psychoanalysis, which is why I always say psychoanalysis actually begins with Fanon. Now watch a psychoanalytic meltdown happen when you tell them that Freud wasn't the originator of psychoanalysis, it was actually Fanon.
Right.
But that's the place because psychoanalysis in its inception as a Eurocentric practice, in terms of where it is, has always imagined subjectivities and disimagined them at the same time as a part of how it creates its sort of frame about who is the subject of analysis and who has an interiority and who doesn't, right? It's only in the white supremacist imaginary that folks of the global South, Arabs and Palestinians exist without interiorities. But that's a creation. I mean, Fanon tells us it's the racist that creates the inferior, right? It's the racist colonizer that continues that structure. So I think with every identification, and psychoanalysis is a mode of social reproduction, right? And it's a method and process and theory of social reproduction, sometimes done on an individual basis through the clinic, but as a theory and as a mode of analysis, it also reproduces a particular social order. So with every identification, who's analyzable, who shows up in our clinics, who are the people who can be, you know, brought into modernity, all the things that we can think about. There's also an explicit ask to disidentify from everybody that can't in the racist imaginary, right? But what I'll also say in that regard is the absencing of Fanon is not an arbitrary, you know, accident about that. It's very much a decision psychoanalytically, because it happens with everybody else also. Every Marxist is absented from psychoanalysis, right? Erich Fromm, who talks about hate, is absented. Wilhelm Reich is absented. You know, Guattari, Deleuze, every single person that said, actually, this thing called the psyche is saturated with everything that's social and political, somehow finds its way outside of the curriculum. Fanon has a special place, though, because in addition to what he was bringing to bear, that like colonialism and settler colonialism are at the heart of this. And he was a Marxist, right? In Black Skin, White Mask, he says, I'm Marxist first, and then I'm a psychoanalyst. So he's talking about capitalism as well. And so that is not by accident, but then also later on, he says, it's actually psychoanalysis that commits me to the practice of alleviating the conditions of suffering, of psychic suffering, which is why I'm committed to anti-colonial struggle. He's clear on this. So psychoanalysis has a decision point. It's like, do we stabilize social order, which it is, if it's a mode of social reproduction, its investments, its own identifications is to stabilize that social order. And so you have to disappear the militant. You have to excise the militant that tells us no, and that also says, I'm a psychoanalyst, and in that ethical commitment, I'm also a gun runner. I also harbor, right? I harbor militants under the guise of care. I make sure that militants are taken care of. I am insistent on the place of women in the revolutionary struggle. All of that destabilizes psychoanalysis's institutionalized aim, right? And I think we start to see this, that every time a dissident or somebody who is serious about making, and I'll say demanding, that psychoanalysis cashes out on its theoretical promises, that's when the meltdown happens. That's when we're like out. And it's a parallel process that matches Freud.
Right.
Freud ousted every single person that came up against him. That's their repetition compulsion, right? So there's all these ways in which this shows up. It's the only possible version of a white supremacist psychoanalysis that could exist, which is why I demand the returning of the theft of everything that was thought on in psychoanalysis is also the history of Europe. So everything that was produced by a Eurocentric psychoanalysis is based on the theft and plunder of the global South and all its colonies, right? And so that's why we center Fanon and say, here's his rightful place in psychoanalysis.
I think that, and also thinking about psychoanalysis as a mode of social reproduction is also really, really helpful as well. I wanted to move to Palestine in terms of thinking about these practices as well, and to talk about something in the psychoanalysis under occupation book, where you rethink what a symptom is, right? And you kind of rethink the symptom as a pharmacon. So I want to quote a little bit here. Quote, "Yet we will also remember, and we'll see elsewhere, that just as the symptom is a marker for violence, a primer to the precarity of one's innocent happiness, it also preserves a trauma, along with other traumas that serve as foci to remember one's condition of occupation, and therefore providing the promise and goal of liberation," end quote. So this is from the research in the West Bank that I think happened in like 2017, 2018, over a number of years, right?
For like 4 or 5 years.
So many of the symptoms that you are writing about, that you encounter, that Palestinians are experiencing in the West Bank, some of which are, this is a very partial list, but death anxiety, schizophrenia, suicidal ideation, have these undersides to them that you're kind of pulling through. So you theorize suicide as a refusal to accede to being denied the right to life, right? The elderly man, and this was a very moving kind of set of passages here. There's the elderly man who is diagnosed with schizophrenia understands that his illness allows him to, quote, stay home in Jerusalem, in a place where everyone is being constantly uprooted. So Zionist violence is, quote, converted into a psychosis that ensures that he will be riveted to his ancestral home, end quote. And then you kind of allude to the fact that the symptom is actually understood as a kind of samud, right? Yeah. So I think this framing of symptom as the opening towards liberation rather than something that needs to be crushed or resolved is kind of, you know, for me, it resonates with some of the work that I was doing in the Right to Maim around the relay between debility and capacity, right? There's no such thing as like pure debility. You write in the book that we are considering what becomes worthy as identifiable signs and symptoms, right? So the symptom has to become worthy of its naming and recognition. The symptom has to have a certain coherence for it to be named and recognized. And I'm thinking also about Mel Chen's work on the ways in which bodies are not coherent and yet are demanded to be produced in kind of coherent ways. And of course, once named and recognized, it also just takes on a coherence. So I'm really would love to hear more about the implications of situating and depathologizing symptoms as pharmacon, as both poison and remedy. And relatedly, we can get into a little bit about how you understand the relationship between psychic warfare and the production of chronic debilitation under siege conditions.
Okay. very small question.
There are like
No, I love
20
it.
questions in each
I love
question,
it.
I'm sorry.
I love it. It gives me life to
Go
be able
wherever
to
you
go
wanna
there.
go, yeah.
Yes. So let me start with like the symptom, first of all, and I think this is like psychoanalysis. What's so interesting to me is psychoanalysis is a theory that sort of has the theorizing around the intrapsychic, what happens in the symptom, and the reality principle. And magically, the reality principle is like always written out of like what happens with the reality principle, then you're just stuck in this localized, individualized feeling of the symptom, and the reality principle on which it relies or it's constituted by disappears. So I think this is like symptom in the book, in the upcoming book, I talk about it as symptom as register, right?
Mhm.
That like the demand for us to actually rush to repair, which is a demand of settler colonialism. It's a demand of power. It's a demand of everybody who wants to rush to the end point without any attention or attunement to what does it mean to dismantle the structural pieces that created the condition to begin with. I think it's the same thing with the symptom. When if you think about the trauma industry in general, the rush to free us from these symptoms becomes very suspicious under conditions where the symptom is a register that helps people root themselves in the reality of what is happening. So this moving, we heard many of these same stories where folks, particularly in Jerusalem, and this is the thing, it's localized to certain places where homes are being demolished or stolen entirely. That happens across Palestine, but in Jerusalem particularly, right, we're there in this sort of particular moment, and people's symptoms start to match that. So somebody with schizophrenia has a symptom of being lifted up to fly away. And then when you sort of talk a little bit more, he actually literally was lifted up by IOF soldiers and taken away, right? And the rootedness, I can't leave the bounds of my home because if I do, I will fly away, becomes a way in which the rootedness to home stays, he's allowed to stay there. And he's also and bless you, whoever it was. Yeah, exactly. So, so this becomes the way now. There's a way in which psychoanalysis, in its way of being practiced in a Eurocentric way, if we go back to the previous question, it's not a question of not registering those symptoms. It's not like people don't see those symptoms, but it's about an ideological misattunement to what they register. So somebody would see that and might move away from the originary source of what is being reproduced in this symptom here, right? And it's not to reduce it only to that, but it's to say, if we're thinking sociogenically, if we're thinking in a way that brings in the material and social and political as regularly as the intrapsychic, why wouldn't there be a way in which people are remaining tethered, even in the psychosis? You're tethered to the understanding that this is an actual possibility. If I leave these gates, I will be detained. I will be taken. My home will be taken from me. That's not a psychosis. That's history, right? And that's a living process that we see, of course, happening in Silwan and all these sort of places right now. So I think that's the symptom as register and not rushing to repair. So people hold on to that, right? It preserves it in a particular way. This is where the reality testing comes in. And when I say reality testing, I don't mean it in an ableist way, like somehow a totalistic idea of what reality is. I mean that people being connected to the material forces of oppression that are actually happening in real time. And what a depoliticized psychoanalysis would have us do is displace that all into the intrapsychic. So I was on a talk earlier today and somebody mentioned that this is a clinician, and they were mentioning that international bodies in psychoanalysis particularly have been utterly useless in terms of theorizing or mentioning anything. Just as a side note, I don't need these organizations to say anything, right? They're violent from the get-go, and I don't need them to make comments, liberal, feel-good comments about Palestine. But she said that her analyst had said to her, oh, you're feeling, she was saying, I'm very frustrated, but it feels like a very colonial attempt. And her analyst said to her, it's because your mother colonized you that you end up feeling like this. I wish I could make this up. The number of, I'm saying this because it's so de-identified, because the number of times that I hear people saying this or have this experience, which shows us the deflection and displacement actually comes from the technique and the method.
Right.
It's not the person.
Right.
The person's like, I know what this is coming from. And the therapist is the one that's engaging in the seduction into the deflection away from the symptom as registered. If we hold on to the symptom, we're also able to hold on to tracing and tracking who it is that causes the symptom. And that's the piece, that's the issue I take with the trauma industry is everybody wants somebody with a trauma without the traumatizer. The second you are naming who it is in a systematic way that causes trauma, that's when people start to be like, well, hold on a second, this is political now, right? And I think that being attuned to those spaces, being attuned to the expansiveness of the symptom, and what is the generative mode. Avdisa Katipulu talks about this in terms of trauma, about what is generative that could come from that. That is very different than us saying there's no trauma being enacted.
Right.
We understand,
Right.
the deep impact, but we also understand that that is on purpose. It's not, and I think that's the debility part, is that if we're to take that up, if there is a debilitated Palestinian, which I move away from that sort of reading, because I think every single day it's incumbent upon us and it's our responsibility to see the ways that people create life despite the insistence on debility, right? So even the suicide that you talk about, and this is really hard for psychologists to go near, mainly because they fear, insurance companies taking away their license. I'm gonna be honest about that. They can't think in a really critical way. It's like, what does it mean for somebody to to have a relationship as defiant to death as they do to life? And to say that if the way I die, and this person was in Gaza, if the way I die is circumscribed by the settler colony and always decided, even the minute of death is decided, how I die is decided, what does it mean to seize that and have the possibility of life as easily as the possibility of death? They're hard things to think through.
Yeah, definitely.
But that is kind of what we're getting at here.
Yeah, I think it's, the symptom as register instead of rushing to repairs, so important. And I think there's also this kind of, you've mentioned these things, the moving from symptom to diagnosis. When I was researching the right to name, one of the most painful things I kept coming across was that the literature I was reading on mental health kept saying Gaza is the best place in the world to study the mental health of children during war, right? So this kind of the trauma industry, but also academic knowledge production. So, it's like we're problematizing trauma as a colonial imposition,
Yes.
As a diagnosis that NGOs actually use to fuel their funding streams while acting benevolently. So I'm also thinking about the Rita Giacomin, who is this incredible researcher at Bear State University at the Institute of Community and Public Health, who actually warned us decades ago, I think at this point, that there was an overdiagnosis of mental illness as part of this kind of depoliticizing apparatus that sustains settler colonial occupation, and then that produces this kind of facile binarization between disabled and non-disabled bodies, rather than kind of attending to these complexities of suffering under colonial rule. And this was also in a work where she warned about, again, decades ago, about PTSD as nonsensical in a place where there's no beginning or end to the kind of traumascape of colonialization. And so there's this ongoing suspicion towards diagnosis and medicalization in conversation with Fanon as well. So, one thing that you're kind of unfolding for us is like, what are, these different tools and frames, language that we have to acknowledge harm without capitulating in totality to that harm, and also without endlessly individuating around that harm. And so I kind of want to transit into this, one of the most, I think, important interventions in both projects is how you manage to transform the psyche as an object belonging to an individual to the psyche as a collective experience,
Yeah.
right? And to de-exceptionalize the individual in psychoanalysis can seem like a paradox, right? We have this kind of enduring image rife in Western media portrayals in the public imaginary of a privileged analyzand, on the couch, paying huge amounts of money to be there, right? So I want to hear more about how you came to understand the collective psyche of Palestinians while you were researching this book in the West Bank. And then also, how do you think of the Palestinian collective psyche now in the face of this accelerated iteration of genocide? And then maybe some more details on a pragmatic level. How does clinical praxis in Palestine demolish this image of the individual on the couch, right? Because you write, practicing psychoanalytically in Palestine is a collective endeavor. How are clinics run differently? How is the talking cure re-scripted for the collective?
Yeah, let me start there and work backwards. I think the fact that psychoanalysis is practiced in Palestine already disrupts all of this. Because when you talk to people, I mean, the number of people that were like, what do you mean? That's the racist imaginary I'm talking about. That also takes us back to an earlier question about psychoanalysis as a practice and a method and a theory. Who does it imagine belongs in those spaces? And Said said that, right? Edward Said was, I'm paraphrasing here about like, Freud didn't imagine that there would be Arabs reading Freud, but there is and there was, right? But it's not just a mimetic process that if you look at the idea of being interested in the psychic, in the emotional and the affective, that's why we bring in nefes, right? Psyche, soul, breath, self. These concepts of working on the self and being reflective and understanding how that interacts with it have things that long predate psychoanalysis as we know it, but the disimagining of that and the relocating it in its source, as though like the source of this starts in Europe, it matches the project of colonialism and imperialism and racism, right? So in many ways to crib, like if we can think about the subaltern has always spoken about these things, and yet psychoanalysis has never been attuned to that because the imagined person, right? The subject that sits in front of a psychoanalyst is never a Palestinian, is never an Arab, is never a racialized subject in many of these ways. So I think it already disrupts that paradigm, insisting that there are people thinking through this, and there are people thinking through this not as just I'm bringing something from the West and doing it here. There are people who are generating knowledge with their patients under current conditions where like one of the clinicians who shared stories with us, like we'd be sitting in a session, and this was in Bethlehem, we'd be sitting in a session and gas comes into the session, and like that becomes part of the conversation. Or if the checkpoints are the same checkpoints we go through, what does it mean to live in a topography where our psychic process and our social processes are circumscribed by this, but are not a stand-in for everything else that makes us who we are, right? And I think that meaning making, that struggle to make meaning, to both understand that there is this process, this machine, this structure that is intent on creating debility. That's the intention. And what does it mean to constantly negotiate that? To have the subjectivity that can live in defiance and sometimes fail at that too under the crush, and then have a space where that's worked on and worked through because you believe your theory. Like if the theory says that this has the expansiveness where we can stretch it and think about desire and identifications and counter identifications, we see that crash on Palestine. Everything falls apart. Like somehow there's no more thinking through these layers or these textures. And I think that's what people, in Palestine, really, people who are practicing it. One of the things that I'll say about like, how do we sort of think about this as a Palestinian psyche? I don't mean to overgeneralize and say there's one such thing. I hope it doesn't come across like that. To the contrary, but what it does mean is there is a psyche to be explored that is animated, that is dynamic, that is doing work. And that is happening even as we see the most atrocious, extension of the Zionist settler project in the genocide that's unfolding in Gaza, right? People every day are making meaning out of what is happening, just like our political prisoners make meaning out of the psychic and understand and trace what are the mechanisms that seek to plant themselves inside of us in an interiority to reconfigure the internal world to match the deathscape outside, right? That's the collective psyche that I'm thinking about. What does it mean to engage in a refusal to have our interior be reconfigured? And our interior is like, that's an invitation for us all, but also to see an invitation to be precise and to be careful and to see when this is happening, when people are showing us every single day. I saw a video of children in Gaza just yesterday ripping up these genocidal flyers and just repeating, this is the repetition. We will not leave. We will not, until the last colonizer is gone, we will not leave no matter what that is a affirmation of life, of presence, of a psychic knowledge that the invitation to be expelled is not an arbitrary one. It's one that's coming from a settler colonial genocidal machine that has been at this for 75 plus years. And it's a recognition and it's a naming of that, and then the defiance, the act of defiance that happens. For me, that's the psyche we're talking about. And that's a psyche that's beholden to the idea of psyche as Fanon gifts it to us, as one that is constantly in negotiation and in the process of becoming alienated rather than alienated. The alienation being, we live in a world in which we're just circumscribed by the conditions that we're told are there, and we believe that these structures have no way to bend to us, right, to our will. But this alienation is one that says, no, making the colonizer bend by our refusals is precisely what creates possibilities.
Yeah, this is, I mean, you kind of answered like one of the questions too, which is like, how are you thinking about psychic militancy
Yes.
in Gaza right now, right? So we can kind of keep on that line as well. I had written for Ghassan Abu Sitta a whole a kind of research, like a policy paper on the history of amputations in Gaza, right? And so now we're looking at something maybe like 11,000 amputated children and adults, and also, that's like 5, 6, 7 times the number of amputees that existed before October 7th. And so and so what's most interesting about that are the rituals that start becoming performed around dismemberment. So Ghassan Abu Sitta talks about the burial ritual of like the amputated limb being put into a box and the name of the child and then the name of the limb being written on that box and being buried. And he says oftentimes these children are not even old enough to know their names, right, or speak, right? And I'm thinking also about Nader Shalab Kevorkian's work on Ashla and the way that she's,
Hello.
this was like an incredible episode of Makdisi Street. If you haven't seen the interview with Nader Shalab Kevorkian, where she's talking about a young girl telling her cat, "Please don't eat me when I die."
Hi, can you hear me?
Who are you? I don't know who. Yes, we can hear you. All of us can hear you. She's talking about that. She's also talking about this father who is collecting the limbs of his children, right? The severed limbs of his children in a garbage bag and saying, I will not orphan these children and I will not be, childless. And so we're, the idea of Ashla is really incredible. These are actually just some examples of, I think, precisely what you're talking about,
Yes.
right? Like the kind of psychic militancy. I guess I'm wondering about this thing of the individual psyche, collective psyche. How are you thinking about the psyche, not just as of the mind, but of the body as well. Like, how can we break down this mind-body split? And also kind of often what happens between kind of mental and intellectual disabilities and physical disabilities, like there's that work of the, not just the individual to the collective, but also the mind to the body. I think that's happening in a lot of what you're talking about.
Yeah, this is where the concept of nafs in Arabic really comes in, right? Like psyche, soul, breath, self, that the split is not baked into that. There's an idea that all these things are configured and that's what makes us who we are, or that's what constitutes our being. And so let me go to these moving examples. Steve and I actually wrote a piece called Reverie of Resistance that talks about the writing of children's names on their body parts in Kate, right? So their parents would write their names. And I think there's a way in which, as we should, all of us should be horrified by what that means. But this is the attunement to something else that's there. And I think this is what Nadra invites us into, and what Hassan also in conversations with him, what he invites us into is, can we, have an oblique reading that moves beyond the expectation of the oppressive system, that there's a foreclosure here. There's only one way for this to potentially happen. And that one way, that's not us disavowing or detracting from the possibility that when somebody writes the names of their child on their limbs, they have thought through and recognized the possibility of their death. But for us to sort of reorient ourselves and say that if we have allowed for a condition like Gaza to happen, that possibility of death was always there. And that's the reality testing, number one, about the imminent potential of life and death are constantly, simultaneously existing under conditions of settler colonialism that insist on erasure and death. And also a refusal that these kids will only be a memory that's erased. They are full beings that are marked in their fullness. And that's what their parents are doing in their reverie, is saying this. And that's what Nadira says, that this kid belongs to me. The father we all saw, hawdi wuladi, hawdi wuladi. These are my kids. They're not just pieces. It's a reconfiguration of the fullness of their being in life as much as in death. And that's her idea about ashla. So it's running counter, but that is a challenge for us. I don't want to dismiss how hard it is to read in that counter, really in a feminist way, right? In a decolonial feminist way, to say what other possibilities of being in life are here that don't detract from the suffering as well. But in that moment, I think people get worried that if we go in that direction, we're not doing justice to the horror. I think that father registers the horror. We know that. What does it mean to allow the dignity of the ritual of burial of that against the machine that wants to insist this can't happen? Right. Because if it can't happen, that means that perhaps this person wasn't here to begin with. That again, the continuation of the racist imaginary that this person doesn't have an interior, that the only thing that's there is the death that we control. And then here come people and say, you don't get to control everything about this. Even if this doesn't look the way that we want it to in our imaginary, that somebody is insisting this limb belonged to somebody, and I will give it the dignity of that life that it belongs to or belonged to. There's something so deeply powerful and really emotional. And I think if it's for us in this room online to sort of come into this idea of symptom as register, whatever affect is being mobilized in us right now as we go through that, what does it mean to say this also preserves the memory of this being, and to recall who it is and what it is that insisted on its dismemberment, right?
Yeah, I think I was struck by, Nadra's thinking around ontological reclamation. And then, Hassan is talking about how the amputated limb must become a badge of honor. And it's the history of amputation in Gaza is so intense and, you know, it's particularly after the Great March of Return.
Yeah.
It really is meant to become on the part of, or the desire of, or whatever, the Israeli state, the intention is to create amputation as a signature injury. Right? So signature injury. So everything has to militate against that signature injury, right? And I think you're pointing out all of the ways in which that is happening on a daily basis. I think we're always over time. Before I go to the audience for questions, is there anything else you want to share with us that's on your mind right now that you would like to offer us?
If you
And
will,
then please think through some questions for Lara.
if you'll indulge me to root ourselves in Gaza and uplift the voice of this is from a linguist academic whose name is Ahmed Kamal Janina. And it was something that was released today that he wrote, but I think encapsulates, when I read it, it almost took my breath away in terms of an instantiation and sort of praxis of psychic militancy, and also a reminder to us about why presence is important. So I'm just going to read a couple of his statements. And he's talking about the difficulty to think when he's starving. It's hard to keep the mind sharp when the body is thin and dehydrated, but solidarity is teaching starving students their thoughts still matter. I must admit, I write this piece while starving, too hungry to think clearly, too weak to sit upright for long. I do not feel ashamed because my starvation is deliberate. I refuse my hunger even as it decays me. I can survive no other way. Famine is no longer a threat. It is here. Some days my stomach cramps as I try to revise a single paragraph. My fingers feel dry and achy, parched from lack of fluids. Hunger is loud. I read, but hunger is shouting in my ear. I write, but the maw snaps with every keystroke. This is not about ego. It is about refusing to disappear, about resisting the slow erasure that comes with war and famine, about insisting that our thoughts and our work continue even when it must be done in the ruins. In Gaza, to be an academic today is to refuse to be reduced to a statistic.
Oh, listen, thank you.